'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. We have a fabulous show for you today. We're going to be exploring what is faith with Dr. Swanson-Leadbetter, who is a marriage and family therapist and has a doctorate in ministry, as well as Pastor Nathan Neighbor, who's a lead pastor at Mosaic in Pomona. Today we're going to be tackling a very tough question. What is faith, and how does faith help us? Thank you very much, and welcome to the Circle.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start off with Pastor Neighbor.
Yeah.
What is faith?
Yeah, it's a big topic, right?
Sure is.
My grandmother had a saying that I grew up with around faith, and it's 4 parts. It's kind of an easy thing to remember. Faith is believing it's so when it isn't so that it may be so, because God said so. So believing, what the unseen before it ever happens, so that you can presence it here and now, and knowing that it's going to come to pass because God has said that it's going to come to pass. So for me, faith is essentially believing in the unseen. It's knowing that there's a reality that's bigger than what we can touch, taste, feel, and smell. All of our circumstances, the things that are in front of us, that is in some ways more real than the tangible physical universe around us.
How so? How is it more real?
Yeah, I would say that our circumstances obviously play a part in who we are. We can look at our bank account. We can look at our relationships. We can look at our physical car, the things that we own, and that's certain part of our reality. Obviously, it's our physical, tangible reality here and now. I think faith allows us to step into the reality that it's unseen, the reality of our thoughts, feelings, the reality that I would say that God exists in. And it allows us to step into that, essentially transcend the here and now, and to step into a reality that I would say is bigger and more powerful than just the tangible universe that we live in.
Excellent. Yeah. And how do people process this concept of faith, Dr. Swanson? I mean, it's kind of an unusual concept. There's nothing, like, as Pastor Neighbor said, we can't see it, we can't hold it, but it seems to be an integral part of our psychological makeup.
Right, yeah, and I think it depends on where you're coming from, but there's a whole theology that integrates with psychology about faith development would come first from your family and even from parenting, and your image of God or from the image of love might come with how you were treated, how you were brought up. The design of that would be God's parenting us. And so that would be one way of looking at the idea of faith and how we get that. But the idea would be, how do you see your life, your vision? What do you look for in terms of the future, your power in the world, your influence over people? And I think I would boil it down to love, in terms of the ability to impact people and create love in the world.
So you're kind of insinuating, it seems like our past influences maybe our level of faith and what our faith could be?
Yeah, possibly. I think I've also met people that have had horrible backgrounds, and they would choose faith or a God who would redeem that, or who would repair broken relationships and hurtful things in their life too. So it can go either way. It can give us resource and strength for images of God or of images of faith, or it can also be a place of redemption, I think, of healing from the past.
And I know right now there are different movements. There's one movement right now is all science-based. Mm-hmm. Everything's about reason. And we don't advocate either side on the show. We try to educate people and bring them awareness. How would you get somebody to say, look, some things can't be scientifically proven right now.
Yeah.
So how do you get them to do that Kierkegaard leap of faith?
Ooh,
yeah,
one.
That's a good one.
We love Kierkegaard.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah. For me, I have lots of friends who fall on the whole spectrum of science, faith, religion, and have great conversations all the time. And what I find is that it's not a question of if you have faith, it's what you have faith in. I think if you are human, you have faith. You are constantly interacting with the unseen. And when I say that, like our emotions, our thoughts, I think all those fall into the spiritual realm. And so, if you're in a relationship with someone, you have faith that they're going to actually come through. If you have children, you have faith that you're actually rearing this person to be a healthy individual. You're creating a future that is not yet presenced itself. You have this level of trust and belief that something that has not yet been presenced is going to be presenced because you believe so. So from my standpoint, it's not if you have faith, it's what you put your faith in, and is that faith actually moving you towards the person that you want to become and the future that you long to create for yourself and the world around you. So for me, science and faith interact perfectly like that because we're constantly in a state of putting our trust in something,
Excellent. Actually brings me another question, but before I get to that question, I have another one for you.
Okay.
So, he says believing in something, which is a great point. He talked about we have faith in all these little things in our lives. Like he said, faith in our child growing up to be a certain way. What do you think that brings for us as human beings? What kind of, does it bring us a safety net? Is it a security thing that does faith bring us?
Yeah, I would say faith is not safe, and it's dangerous. And I think depending on where you come from, but at least on my faith in Christianity and in Jesus, it's a call to getting messy and to being in unsafe things, actually risking. But I think what it does bring is hope and power to bring forth a legacy that you believe you want in your life. So we were talking on the way here, and I was saying my desire with my children who are grown now and starting their own family is to be the kind of mother or mother-in-law that creates harmony and joy around the holidays. So rather than being demanding or saying you have to be at my house on Christmas morning, it's asking them and creating. So the vision of the legacy is putting forward the kind of mother or mother-in-law I want to be, and then lining up my actions and my intent and my impact about that vision. So it's casting a faith vision in the future and then lining up your actions towards that. But for me, that would involve faith and who God is calling me to be in this world, and the impact of who I am in my own power and my own influence on the world.
So it sounds like to me, both of you are using faith as, in a sense, as a tool for your vision and purpose in life.
Absolutely.
Both as a tool, and I think for me it informs from the future. It's also, for me, it's a relationship with God of what God wants to create in the world too, not just me and about my little kingdom world, but about God's kingdom and what's being called forth in the world. So it's a dialogue or a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's what separates it from maybe like wishful thinking or even maybe popular ideas of hope or the laws of attraction that are so popular today. I think for me it is a dialogue. It's me hearing from God of what it is that He's doing and connecting with that, and then putting my faith in that rather than just declaring that something's going to be so and
Right.
hoping that it comes around. It's almost like being informed of what God's doing in the world around me, and then putting my faith and trust in that, and moving forward. That like that's going to be so.
That's wonderful. We're going to explore that a little bit more. That was a great analogy with laws of attraction, or not an analogy, but a juxtaposition. Let me talk about a little bit the negative side of faith. Some people, you say, it could be a negative because you're believing in something that's not really there. You're deluding yourself.
Sure.
You don't know what could really happen. You're giving yourself a false sense of hope. And you brought that in there. You made a great point about faith as being risky. What are some of the negatives about faith? Or are there negatives?
Sure. I mean, we have diagnoses about faith, schizophrenics that would say, I am God, or I could, we were just talking about the snakes and how, snake handlers, you would say, well, God will protect me from the snake biting me. So that to me would not be the kind of risk that would be a dangerous risk. So there can be delusions, there can be places of false hearing, and that's why I think community and being in a faith community is important to balance and check out what your thoughts or your beliefs are, so that you're having feedback about when you get off or when they can be delusional. So we've certainly seen all kinds of people that have said and claimed pretty bizarre things about God or what God's asked them to do. So there's a check and a balance, I think, when you're in a faith community. And that's one of the things that I'm sad about in our culture is so many people say, well, I'll just have faith or spirituality at home by myself with God. And they miss out on the beauty of what a faith community is and how relationships can help support us and help us, I think, keep on a faith track that's more sane, more balanced, truthful. That's a better word, truthful.
Now, Dr. Swanson alluded a little bit to faith in religion, which could be dangerous, such as maybe the serpent handlers. And I know you're a pastor of a church. How long have you been a pastor there?
I've been a pastor for 8 years.
8 years.
Yeah.
What have you seen anything that could be negative in the sense of faith?
Sure, absolutely.
All the time, every day.
Yeah. It's funny because I think there's a popular idea that faith is a crutch. Faith could be a crutch for helping people deal with their issues. And I think when you actually authentically live a life of faith, you step out theoretically onto the waters. I think of the greatest story in the scriptures of Peter jumping out, walking on the water. I mean, that's a level of faith right there. And then he begins to sink. If you read through that story, he falls on his face and he doubts and all that stuff. And yeah, I've seen people put their faith into things that they never should have put their faith into. Into people, things, money, and then. Like Dr. Ann Swanson said here, like that they often will hear things from God that he may never said, that they just came up on their own. And so oftentimes then they can be disillusioned with God, disillusioned with their faith. Maybe it's like the whole learning that Santa Claus isn't real for the first time. All of a sudden, everything that they've believed now
He's
dissipates.
not real?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, Carlos.
And so I think if you build a reality on the construct that God exists and he's loving and he's going to take care of you, and then he quote unquote doesn't come through when you've lived by faith, it can be very disappointing, jarring, leave people quite jaded. I've had so many conversations with people who said, I trusted God for something and he didn't come through, and so I can't ever put my faith in a God who's loving and caring. So I think there is a risk there of that. And like we talked about earlier, I think that's the power of having community around you when you're in faith, because there's a sort of checks and balances of people that say, yeah, I agree, or hey, you might want to pray on that some more, or check that out a little longer before you go full force with that.
Excellent. You actually touched on something. I know we lightly touched on our past show. We had Pastor Turnipseed was here, and we kind of glossed over a challenge that he had when he was younger. So I'll throw this out here, and you can do a brief answer if you like. When he was, I think it was 12 or 14, he was younger, his father was beating his mother, and he kept praying every day to stop his father from beating his mother, and the prayer never got answered.
Yeah.
So he thought at the time. Now, as he's older, he realizes two pastors had come to the house and inquired if there were domestic violence occurring at the house, and the mother decided not to pursue it. How would you help somebody in that regard? Because you mentioned faith.
Yeah.
And some people say, look, I can't have faith in a God who allows some of these atrocities to happen.
Yeah.
How would you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. And those situations are quite common where
Yeah.
God didn't show up, so to speak, in a certain situation. And, I think for me, God never promised to make life easier. He never even promised to change our circumstances all the time. I think what he did promise us is that he would be with us. And that he would walk us through the fire, that he'd walk us through the waters, he'd take care of us when there's floods, all of those things. So for me, it's more of a question of how is God shaping you as he's walking you through those circumstances? How is he moving you and defining your character through those circumstances as you live by faith? Because I think the question is, who are you becoming through those circumstances as you walk out by faith, in those moments? Because I've seen people who have gone through the same horrible circumstances and their lives have gone two very different directions based on how they've lived by faith in those. If you can walk through that with the idea of God's with me and wow, he's protected me and I'm here and I'm safe and I'm okay, that is a very different perspective than how could you have let this happen? How could you have, allowed this to take place? I think faith allows us to have the same circumstances, but to be shaped into two different people based on where we live in that.
That's fabulous. And
Yes, I wanted to add to that too. I think given that circumstances with that young boy, the other option is you can sit and say, God help me, God help me, God help me, or there can be action. So I think sometimes the idea of faith is God will come in and do something versus I also am a partner with God. So, obviously he was young, but what about him going and telling somebody, revealing it, asking for help. So I think one of the things I appreciate about our community of faith is that there's a call to action often in faith, that you don't sit back passively and wait for God on things unless you've done everything you can, but that you're an active participant in bringing forth love and hope and restoration. So to empower people to not be victims of circumstances, but to move into action.
So take some responsibility.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, I wanted to approach a little bit with you is, should we step outside of this crisis? For instance, we're in a crisis, and we have faith, and as Pastor Neighbor was talking about, maybe looking at it as God is with us. Does it benefit us to step outside of the crisis going on and say, what is God trying to teach me here?
Yes. You want to answer that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll step out of my own crisis right now and answer in a minute.
Yeah, I think for me that's one of the greatest gifts of faith is it gives us greater perspective.
Yeah.
Knowing that when I find myself in those moments of crisis, I just have a phrase that I say is this isn't the end. This isn't all there is. Mm-hmm. And I think when I say there's a reality that's bigger than what we can see and touch and smell here, is faith allows us to transcend the here and now, pause for a moment and go, all right, what's the larger picture that God's doing here in this moment? What's the larger action that he's trying to do either within me or within the world around me? I mean, when we look through great characters of the scriptures, every single one of them could have paused in several moments of their lives, whether it's Noah, Joseph, Mary and Joseph, and gone, this is horrible, where is God in this? But their faith allowed them to transcend the here and now, to look towards a bigger picture and step into that rather than to be held down by the moment of crisis.
Yeah, and you were, in your sermon the other day, you were talking about the great faith cycles that they actually have high points in their life and then they dip down to some kind of crisis, then they have another high, and then they often have a second dip down. And you said that people often stop at this second point and say, God's not here if I go through the second crisis. Is that how you said it? Yeah,
exactly.
So the idea is, how do you face crisis with a God view of it? And for me, it's been helpful to study the scripture to talk about the fellowship of suffering. And that's a part that we don't like, at least in modern evangelical culture, it's kind of like God's my personal servant and will create a world that benefits me. And that's not what scripture really calls forth. It calls forth being willing to go through difficult time periods and have your character developed through suffering, and not wanting to be a masochist and volunteer for it, but you letting it work you so that you're a deeper person. And for me, in my own life at least, I think those places have made me a better therapist, so I can sit with people in suffering, and I hope I don't have pat answers that just say, well, that, God took care of that, but to be empathetic and be with people in the suffering, I think is part of the development of character that I've experienced, I hope, through suffering.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
We're going to try to look at God as more of a human being, and can we even look at him as that? I mean, he has created this entire universe. That changes our perspective in life, so we're going to kind of delve into the psychology and relationship aspect of God. So I guess the first question is, how do we relate to God?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, when I think through that, I have to go back to Genesis in the very beginning. And if we're created in God's image, I think there's a part of us that when God created us, he created us in his likeness and in his image. And he created us to be in perfect relationship with him, walking in the garden, talking, being connected with him, even co-creating with him in the world. I mean, he takes Adam and Eve and puts them in the garden and says, hey, everything's here for you. Go do what you want, in that. And so I think that's the relationship that God originally intended for us to have as friends, as his image, created in his image. And so I think all of human history has been God attempting to redeem us back to that relationship where we can walk together again, where we can talk together again, where we can be in intimate relationship with one another in that context.
I want to push the envelope a little bit here because I'm trying to flesh out God a little bit.
Yeah.
And now you said the image of us.
Yeah.
So is that physical, or do you think it's more psychological? How does he represent us? Because God does seem to have a personality in the Bible. We've seen him get jealous. We've seen him get angry. We've seen him show love.
Yeah, I think I would say it's neither of those. It's spiritual. So, I mean, theology is trying to describe humanity and God in so many ways, but the key parts, which aren't separate, but is, mind, soul, spirit, body. So, I mean, the closest I think it gets to is there's a spirit. And what's interesting is when people die, they actually measure the body right before and after death, and there's actually a perceptible weight loss that goes down within seconds after death. So, I mean, the belief is something leaves the body that is a spirit that is alive. So I would say it's a spiritual likeness of or stamp of God on us.
It's a wonderful answer.
Thank you.
And hopefully we don't get anybody trying to jump the gun and lose weight for the holidays.
Yeah. not a good plan there.
No. Now, there does seem to be differences in relating to God from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It seemed to me he was more remote in the Old Testament. He became a lot closer in the New Testament. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, it seems like from Genesis through the Old Testament, it was God attempting to repair, the broken relationship between man and him in the fallen sin that taken place in the garden. And so I think it was a lot of rules and regulations of attempting to cleanse humanity to get back to that space. What I love about the New Testament, and really it's one cohesive storyline if you look at it, but it's God just saying, how can we get back to this Genesis point? How can we get back there? And what I love about the New Testament, when Jesus comes, it's God in flesh and bone, coming to be with us. And it's him creating a way through his death so that we could once again be intimately connected with him. There was no need for, sacrifices or rituals. Once again, we could return to that space in Genesis where we can walk with him and be in relationship with him and be connected at an intimate level. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of my thoughts was it really God being different, or was it humanity's interpretation of God that we put on the rules, and we saw God as being more authoritative or more, we had to obey God. I don't know. I believe there is a consistency between Judaism and Christianity, really, that there's a similarity. We're grafted into the branch with Judaism. So, yeah, I'm wondering if it was really God being different or our interpretation of God. But anyway, the gift of Jesus as the New Testament, that there was a way that we didn't have to earn things or that it was given to us in grace and in mercy because we couldn't ever earn it or be enough.
Yeah.
Well, that leads me into one of my favorite questions, which is who chooses who here? So does God choose us or do we choose God? And what I mean by that is sometimes, you read studies and certain individuals that come from certain family upbringings, maybe have a punitive parent, tend to go to churches that represent God as being more punitive. Others that came from a family that was really loving, times go to a church where God's represented as being really loving. Who chooses who here?
Yeah.
You want to start with that one?
Well, you probably know more about attachment styles and what's taking place.
Yeah, I think I would look at it like it's a relationship, which I was going to say earlier, like who's God? It's kind of like saying, who's my child? It's like my child's different at different moments, at different stages in life, too. So I guess so I actually think God's a little different to Nathan than he is to me because it's a relationship. So, I think God chooses us and we choose God. And I think forms, what you were mentioning, different forms of being more strict or more loving, that can evolve over time with people too, and I certainly think people go on a spiritual developmental journey and they seek out different things at different times for their needs. But I think it's a relation where you're choosing and God's choosing you, and then it evolves. But Scripture talks about God always being present and always reaching for humanity. The great painting by Michelangelo, with the Sistine Chapel, the fingers, God's always reaching for us, and then it's how we respond back to God. So I think it's a dialogue.
So the personality differences might be more of accessing certain features of God.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think us being I'm a firm believer that us being created in God's image, I think that each human being on the planet bears a different image of God. That almost like different snowflakes have different images, that we all have a different image that we carry of the Creator. And I love the idea that God had to create 6 billion people on the planet to express all of His attributes. That we're connected with Him in that way. And I had a conversation with an atheist friend the other day about this very thing, and he out of the blue just asked me, "How are you so sure about your relationship with God, about religion? How can you be so certain about this?" And I said, look, I think we're asking the wrong question. The question that we need to look at is, why does humanity throughout time and history pursue God? I mean, there's never been a culture, or there's never been a moment in history where humanity in some way, shape, or form hasn't attempted to pursue some type of higher being. It seems like it's in our DNA to pursue at least a reality that's bigger than us. And so I love the passage in Ecclesiastes that says that God has written eternity on our hearts, that if you're human, you're pursuing a greater reality. And so I think that's part of our being created in His image. We long naturally to reconnect to this God who's created us and loved us. I think it's our life is a journey of us attempting to reconnect to the God who's created and loved us.
That's an excellent point.
And I was going to say, the church we go to is called Mosaic, and the idea is that we are broken pieces of glass formed together in an image like a stained glass mosaic that represents God. So it's the different aspects, rather than people having to believe the same exactly or be the same or all be cookie cutters, like would be more of a cult kind of situation, that the beauty comes from the differences and from the amplification of those differences.
Actually, can you expand a little bit about that? And we'll get back to the attributes of God in a second here. What do you do I think it's the organization's called GAP. What do you do at GAP? Because it sounds like, I know in the first part we talked about faith and how you use it almost as a tool, I think, or in something aspect to help people find vision and purpose in their life. How do you use GAP?
Yeah, well, GAP is an organization that puts on trainings and coaching opportunities for people to have their character transformed and being freed up to live out the calling that they were designed to live. And so we put on one day to 4 day trainings where people have the opportunity to come and take a look at not only their vision, what it is that they long to have happen in their life, but what gets in the way of that. What is it in our own thoughts, our own spirituality that gets in the way? How have we trained ourselves to live small lives, to not engage the fullness of what God has for us, and to step into the beauty of love and relationship in that? And I think that's a huge part of that too, because part of what allows us to connect to God is our own character. If we're living destructive lifestyles, or we're getting in the way, without knowing it, of connecting to God, there's going to be a natural barrier between us and connecting to the Creator of the universe who loves us. And so part of that, our work at GAP, is freeing people up from those barriers to actually experience the fullness of who God is and who they've been created to be with Him.
And we'll repeat it again, but where can they get more information about GAP?
Yeah, it's www.gapcommunity.com on the website there.
Okay, gapcommunity.com. We'll give you more information about that in a little bit. So back to the attributes of God. I know in part 1 we lightly touched on hearing God. That's kind of a tough conversation. I'm trying to find out is, how do we know when it's God talking and not just me wanting to talk? I thought my wife was complex, but then you said 6 billion personalities.
Yeah, your wife's just one snowflake.
Yeah.
Well, I can give an example of that that relates to GAP and to Nathan and I and how we met. I was on the journey of these trainings and had been very transformed in my own life through a weekend, and was praying about, God, how do you want me to work with this in my life? And a co-trainer said to me, if you ever can go to the Mosaic Church, their culture and theology will really embrace these trainings. So I looked it up on the internet, and it was like way far away in LA, and I'm like, I'm not driving to that church. And within a week, the church that Nathan and his father were a part of, their sign changed, like 6 blocks from my house, sign changed from the former church to the title Mosaic Church. And so I was driving by and I saw it, and this conversation was in the back of my mind. And for me, that's how God often talks to me. I call it a synchronistic lining up of things that are beyond coincidence. So it was like, wow, I think I'm supposed to go to that church. Now, I never would have gone to that church without having been influenced by that person, and I walked in with a clear vision that for some reason I'm here at this church to influence these people. And through that, I met Nathan, encouraged him to go to the training. It took 3 years, but he went. And then really both of our lives and our whole community has changed because of that. And so that's one of my ways of listening to God and hearing synchronistic lining up and being willing to be obedient to follow the direction that I'm sensing. Of course, that I check that out with people that I trust too, so that I'm not jumping off of a cliff. But that was one that I've seen really operate and unfold in 6 years, and I know that I've followed the pathway and heard from God in that.
Let me get you to expand a little bit, if I can, on the synchronicity concept. Not everybody might be aware of what that is.
Yeah.
I think it's a Jungian.
Yeah, Jung or Young, however you say it. He came up with the idea that one of the ways God speaks to us is, he put it in quotes, holy coincidences, so that God might speak to us besides an audible voice or a burning bush, that things would line up in ways that would speak the path of God. And so to watch for those and look for those and be willing to be open to those.
And there are particular coincidences, not every coincidence.
Right, yeah. It would be something that wouldn't just be, that would have meaning and that would have direction and purpose. Yeah.
So what do you tell someone who says, Pastor Nathan, I've heard the voice of God?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things that I'll tell them. I'll say, the first thing I always ask is, does it line up with the scriptures or the Bible? Because I believe that the Bible is God's word to us, and we get to know him through that. And it's kind of like the training wheels for hearing God's voice. My wife and I were in a long-distance relationship for a year, and so we wrote letters back and forth, and that's how we got to know each other. So that when we met in person, we knew who each other's were, we knew who our heart was. And I think in the same way, the scriptures give us a clear framework for this is who God is, this is how he speaks, this is his heart. So if it doesn't line up with the scriptures, we right off the bat say, got it, that probably shouldn't be something that you're up to, And then I'll tell them, hey, why don't you share it with about 5 or 6 people who you trust, who also you believe hear from God, and pray through it before you jump in head on, So I believe that there's power in, community and having people share in that same conversation with one another and just checking it out to see, is this God? Do people agree? Do people think you're way off on this? And so I know for me, when I have 5 or 6 people say, yeah, I think you're right on with this, I move forward. And if not, I just kind of table it for a while to see what's next in that.
What's next?
Yeah.
What other voices do you hear?
Yeah.
That's actually leads me to another question. So we got the good side of it.
Yeah.
How to verify it through the Bible, synchronicity, looking for holy coincidences. Now, there are people who say they hear God,
Yeah.
but they hear a lot of other people.
Yeah.
How do we know when it's kind of abnormal psychology, I guess, taking in effect?
Well, Scripture talks about the fruit of the Spirit and the results. So again, to see destruction versus healing and redemption, I think the results will be part of what tells us the direction that we're going. So that would be one thing to look at, I think, too. And then I think you can't overestimate the community, because that's the hearing from other people. So, I mean, I've had clients that have said, well, God told me to go off my medication. I'm like, okay, well, let's check that out. Let's slow that down, because, there can be some disastrous results. I've seen people that have gone off medication. It's been wonderful, and it seems that it is confirming, and other people who have, gone into a manic phase, and obviously they need the medication. So it's I think watching for the results of what happens also.
It's a very individual,
Yeah.
specific. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I'm trying to see how I can phrase this. We have had individuals in the past centuries. Martin Luther, okay, he had the voice, he heard God. We had Constantine, he saw God, I think it was,
Yeah.
at the cross. How do we differentiate these? These seem kind of complicated. We have these individuals that almost led revolutions,
Yeah.
pioneers, some movements from their voices of God. Do you think a lot of these were legitimate? Do you think they were in their head?
Well, in the words from Harry Potter, of course it's in your head. and I think that's the beauty of it, is that God speaks and works in so many different ways. And, whether he speaks directly to you or shows up in a vision or works through synchronicity or
a flood comes.
Yeah, or a flood comes. Or, I've heard people say that, they've heard God in a country western song, and so I think that's the beauty of it.
Really?
Is that there's so many ways that God does show up and he does move. And I think, and oftentimes God's doing multiple things that may seem conflicting in the same time in different places and throughout history. And I think part of that is, trying to see the larger picture of what God's up to. And again, checking in with one another, lining it up with the scriptures. And I think the thing that I always come back to with people is, does this create beauty in the world? Does this move us towards love? Does this move us towards wholeness, towards the virtues that God would have us move towards? And I think that's the most important thing. I have a phrase that I use with people because I think sometimes we get so hung up on what's God telling me, what's my purpose, what's His plan for me. And I often tell people, hey, look, love God and do what you want. Because I think if you do the first well, if you're in tune with God, you're connected with Him, He'll lead. You're just going to naturally become the type of person that makes the right decisions and moves you in those places. I often think, I don't know if God's super interested in what school you go to or what lunch you should have, but I think He is interested in creating beauty and love and hope and joy in the world around us.
That's excellent.
I was thinking about what you were saying historically, like so many, I would call it fringe religions, fanatical, have said God told me to go kill a bunch of people. So, that's what we see historically. And that's an interesting question. Like, I don't know that people know what's crazy and what's really saintly until maybe even after the fact.
Sure.
'Cause I was thinking even Mother Teresa, people are like, wow, what are you doing? That seems kind of crazy to be just giving up your whole life and all your money and everything to serve the poor. But as she walked out her life, it was like, her influence, her impact of sacrificial love has just been powerful. But I think if you did that tomorrow, your wife would call you crazy, probably. So, I think it is about beauty and sacrifice, and even going against maybe our natural human inclination of self-preservation and of selfishness and of a gathering for ourselves in a way that we see the world as limited and fighting each other on a limited kind of survival instinct versus the generosity of believing that there's enough to go around, and God is a God of love and multiplicity.
I see another show developing here with this dynamic duo. Who are the real voices that people are hearing?
Yeah.
Where is it really coming from? But so it sounds like, to start wrapping up, it sounds like creating beauty and love and looking at the big picture, not just looking at this little snapshot of life, but looking at the larger picture of life seems to be the best way to know if God's really talking to you or not.
Yeah, the legacy that you're leaving, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both again for joining us. That was wonderful. Wonderful insight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. If you want more information about this group, it's called GAP. You can look it up at www.gapcommunity.com. See you next time, everyone.